Let me begin my talk on Martin Van Buren by thanking all of you for coming. I admire your incredible devotion to American history. Around the world tonight, millions of people are celebrating Mardi Gras in all kinds of ways, speakable and unspeakable, and yet somehow we're all here, gathered in this cold city, to listen to me talk about Martin Van Buren. You're a very special group of people. I wonder if we should start a new holiday on this day every year devoted to Van Buren and call it Mardi Gras. Thank you and good night. But it is appropriate to talk about Van Buren here in New York. He's New York State's first president, and here at the New York Historical Society. He was a member, as all presidents in the 19th century were. And up on the fourth floor, it took me a while to find it, there is a bust of Van Buren by Hiram Powers, which I really wanted to see because I wanted to see in 3D how far Van Buren's sideburns actually stuck out from the side of his head. And it is an impressive work of sculpture capturing that very well. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt was the most ardent presidential member of the New York Historical Society, and in 1888, on March 12th, 1888, the biggest snowstorm of the 19th century. It was called the Great Blizzard of '88. Teddy Roosevelt lived on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue. And he was so, I don't know what to call him, so ardent in his devotion to history, he walked through the snow to the New York Historical Society, found, of course, that it was all shuttered. No one in their right mind would have been going there that day. Went back home and wrote an angry letter to the director of the New York Historical Society saying, "I noticed that you weren't in on March 12th. That's Teddy Roosevelt. Why did I choose to write this book about Martin Van Buren? It's an excellent question. I wrote it for a reason that I think Van Buren himself would appreciate. I was ordered to do it by a political superior. In this case, Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., the great historian, the editor of this very fine series of short, readable biographies of the presidents. He didn't technically order me to do it, but when he asks you, it feels like an order. So I said yes. There was a certain logic to it. I had worked in New York history in my graduate student career. I'm not from New York, but I was fascinated by New York City in the 19th century. I always have been. And I wrote a dissertation which became a book called Young America, The Flowering of Democracy in New York City. Came out around 1999 with Oxford Press. And it was a study of a certain kind of young journalist slash writer slash political activist who was very active in New York City in the 1830s and 40s and the beginnings of political journalism. And for these young people in their 20s in those decades, Martin Van Buren was a curious kind of hero. He was really the champion of Northern democracy. So I was interested in Van Buren. I was sufficiently interested that on my honeymoon, I actually forced my wife to visit Van Buren's house in Kinderhook, New York, 10 years before I got the Van Buren assignment. So Arthur, in his way, knew that I was the right person. I'll confess I began the project with a little bit of trepidation, often asking myself some of the questions that you're probably asking right now, namely, why am I here? And I searched desperately for ways to make Van Buren interesting to modern audiences. And I was happy when I make an occasional discovery that he had somehow bled into American popular culture. There's a rather well-known episode of Seinfeld in which Kramer is walking down a New York street and he's surprised by a gang of street urchins, and he jumps in the air and goes like this as they're about to attack him, and they stop and say, "Wait, you're one of the Van Buren boys." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "You just gave us the secret symbol, 8 fingers for the 8th president." So that gave me some hope. And there were Doonesbury cartoons about Van Buren during the 1988 presidential campaign, because at that time, George H.W. Bush was seeking to become the first vice president to rise to the presidency naturally since Martin Van Buren. So you can tell I was a little bit desperate to sell Van Buren as I started the project. But then he grew on me, at first slowly, but then in a torrent. And I'd like to talk for the next 20 or 30 minutes about why I now find Van Buren fascinating and important. It's not easy to point out acts of great statesmanship or famous speeches or brilliant acts of legislation, but simply put, his fingerprints are everywhere at one of the great transformative moments in American history, the rise of a functional democracy between Jefferson and Lincoln. That's a long time between the American Revolution and the Civil War, and things changed a lot. And almost everything important that happened in there was affected in some way by the political skill of this humble New Yorker from upstate New York. How did I arrive at this conclusion? Well, it wasn't through the normal acts of a scholar looking for positive examples of leadership. It was more, I looked in descriptions of the often very emotional politics of the 1820s and 30s and 40s and found a real visceral hatred of Martin Van Buren. I thought, aha, that's a good sign. If someone like John Calhoun cannot stand to even mention your name, that's a very good sign. And a lot of people hated Van Buren. He was one of the most hated politicians of the 19th century. He was hated by Southerners, he was hated by Northerners, he was hated intensely by abolitionists. He was hated by the wealthy landowners of upstate New York where he started his career. Everywhere he went, he disrupted the status quo. And again, I thought that's not such a bad legacy for a politician. There's an obscure multi-volume history of New York politics in the first decades of the 19th century by a guy named Jabez Hammond, and it hasn't been reissued in any form since about 1840, and its hero is Martin Van Buren, and that's where I really began to sense that this was a life that changed things forever. So I began to see him as something that we now recognize as a familiar kind of American history, the person who gets knocked down over and over again in his life and keeps getting up, a tough political infighter, a Dutch survivor. His refusal to lose time and time again kept growing on me, especially during a time of writing when I couldn't help noticing high-principled members of the Democratic Party, the party Van Buren founded, losing in election after election, often because of their high principles. So who exactly was Martin Van Buren? Well, as Jim said, he lived conveniently from the bookends of the American Revolution to the Civil War. He's the first president born in the United States, born in 1782, Kinderhook, a small town on the east bank of the Hudson River, about 20 miles south of Albany. Grows up speaking Dutch first before English. He's the only president in our history for whom English is a second language. He tried to maintain throughout his life that he came from a middle-class background, but it seems clear that he really was from the rougher part of Kinderhook. His father was not well-to-do. He owned a tavern on the outskirts of town. Van Buren was born to a second wife, and he grew up in this complicated household with children from different marriages, a slave or two mixed in, all living under one roof, and travelers constantly coming through. It's a bit like Willie Loman kind of environment. And as I wrote this book, I couldn't help thinking a little bit of Richard Nixon growing up in his parents' gas station, basically, observing the ebb and flow of realistic American life. And also Bill Clinton in his grandfather's general store in Hope, Arkansas. And what a profound political education that must be for a very sensitive, very intelligent young person, aware that he's smarter than most of the children around him, desperate to prove himself, and noticing the way people talk to each other, the way they win an argument. Only 2 presidents in all of American history won the presidency without the benefit of service in the military or attendance at college. One was Martin Van Buren. Can you guess the other? Grover Cleveland. So I looked for clues to this emerging personality. They're very hard to find. It seems to me that Van Buren went to a lot of trouble to conceal everything that we now would find most interesting about him. The Horatio Alger myth was not current when he was coming up. It was the opposite. You had to make yourself as respectable as possible. So all these embarrassing evidences of how poor he was and how he had to scrape to make a living are difficult to find. But I found some contemporaneous campaign biographies that I found very interesting when he was running in the 1830s that were written without his permission. One story in particular I liked. In 1798, he's 15 years old. He can't afford to go to school anymore, so he becomes an apprentice to a wealthy Federalist lawyer in Kinderhook named Francis Sylvester. And the first day of work, his mother knits him a rather coarse suit of ordinary homespun cloth. And he shows up for work, and he works all day. And at the end of the day, his employer, who's wearing a nice suit, yells at him for dressing so poorly. And you have to imagine he's probably been on his hands and knees all day cleaning up this office, getting dirty, getting the woolen suit that his mother made him even dirtier. And he ran away for 2 days. He didn't show up for work for 2 days. And on the third day, he came back, and he was wearing the exact same fancy outfit that his employer had been wearing when he yelled at him. And he, for the rest of his life, he was berated for his foppish clothing. And successfully, it was a successful kind of political attack against this poor upstart, that he liked fancy clothes. But when I read that story, I thought there was more to it than that. It's a kind of political weapon in the other direction, saying, I can dress as well as my superiors, and no one will ever push me around again because of the way I look. The Federalists noticed his talent immediately. They heard him speaking to fellow teenagers in the town square. They tried to recruit him for the Federalist Party, and he said no. He instinctively was drawn to the Jeffersonian Party then emerging. And in 1801, he fled Kinderhook, moved to this city, where he came instantly under the spell of Aaron Burr, the famous Aaron Burr, then Vice President of the United States, not yet Hamilton's assassin. It's a fascinating relationship. Again, I wished I could find more out about it, but Van Buren, always circumspect, covers his tracks. But I think there was a lot there, and Van Buren drank deeply from the conversations he had with the still young and charismatic Burr. In 1827, John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary a rumor that has haunted Van Buren to this day, which is that Van Buren was the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. And I so wanted to prove that. And I wasn't able to in time for the publication of this book, but I'm actually still working on it. I found some descendants who were willing to do a DNA test, so I just have to pull it all together. Do I think it's true? Probably not, but it's fun to try. He got married, he had 4 sons, and he became a very successful lawyer working on the circuit in the Hudson River Valley. And his specialty, which first seemed dull to me, grew on me. It seemed to have great significance after a while. His specialty was he studied the great land patents that gave unbelievable amounts of property to the old Dutch families, the patroonships of the upper Hudson Valley, amounts of land that were bigger than European countries. Rensselaerwyck, I believe, is bigger than Belgium. And Van Buren's specialty was looking in the original charters, these moth-eaten old grants from European kings, and finding flaw after flaw after flaw, like the good lawyer he was, and driving them crazy with his punctilious reading of the contract, and basically freeing up huge amounts of land for people like him, lower middle-class Americans who wanted a stake. As he was doing that and traveling the circuit, like Lincoln, he was meeting a lot of fellow lawyers and a lot of voters and becoming deeply political. He rises very quickly through New York politics in the 18-teens, and quickly his particular genius becomes apparent. He's not a great speaker. He's not a great legislator. He is a great herder of sympathetic people. He's a great organizer of men. And so people gather around him, and it's, for the life of me, I can't figure out why. But something was there. And I only say that because he looks unimpressive. He doesn't look tall like Thomas Jefferson. He's not especially handsome like Alexander Hamilton. He doesn't have a soldier's face like Andrew Jackson or George Washington. He's a short guy. He's 5'6". He's the shortest president except for James Madison. And he's rotund, and he's bald, and he's got these huge sideburns. And yet people like him. People congregate around him. And soon he's leading these very important factions. The Bucktails, they're called first, after a kind of hat they wore, and then the Albany Regency. And his specialty, again, is driving a powerful person crazy. In this case, DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York. But ultimately, he rises to the top position. He's the great power broker of New York at a very young age. And in 1821, he cements his political power by ushering through a constitution that vastly reorganizes New York politics. And instantly, with a single document, opens up the number of eligible voters in New York from 100,000 to 240,000. So again, throughout his life, you just see the effects. You don't see his link, but you see the effects, which is a perpetual opening up of the democratic process. He's elected U.S. Senator in 1821, moves to Washington, and quickly becomes a very popular person in Washington because he can deliver New York's electoral votes to anyone who wants to become president, and that's just about everyone in Washington. He still identifies strongly with Thomas Jefferson. In May 1824, he goes to Monticello for a pilgrimage of a couple days, and again, it's unclear what happens, but something did, and I believe there was a kind of laying on of hands from the great Thomas Jefferson, the author of the first American party system, on to Martin Van Buren, the author of the second American party system, because immediately after that, he begins organizing at a federal level. He does the same thing around the U.S. that he had done in New York in the teens. He begins going on these very long journeys, which he disguises as family visits. One of his sons marries someone from South Carolina, or trips for health. I mean, all these hilariously fraudulent reasons, and he's just shoring up a future Democratic Party. And that's what begins to emerge between 1826 and 1828. The Democratic Party usually thinks Thomas Jefferson is its founder, and there are still in places around the U.S. Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. But I think Martin Van Buren is the real inventor of the modern Democratic Party. What Jefferson had invented had faded into something that was unrecognizable in the 1820s. It was not Jefferson's original party. And the whole time Jefferson is creating his organization, he takes great pains to call it anything but a party. He says it's a return to original principles and correcting the mistakes that Washington and Hamilton are making. But Van Buren's not like that. He says we need a two-party system. And it's a new thought, and it's a crucial American thought. And no one ever says this big new idea is attributable to Martin Van Buren, but in my experience, it is. The manifestation of this new party is the 1828 election, which results in an overwhelming triumph for Andrew Jackson. And besides the fact that it's a great political success, Jackson wins easily, it's fun. And that, too, I think, is part of Van Buren's legacy. He involves people in ways that they've never been involved in politics. Parades, songs, banners, streamers. Politics becomes something more than politics. It becomes a form of entertainment. And you read about rallies that go 4 and 5 hours, and drinking, and women and children coming out. And you realize it's not just men talking about weighty issues. It's something beyond that. And that, again, I think is the inspiration of a young tavern keeper's son. Throughout the Jackson presidency, Van Buren plays a very important role. He emerges from several contenders as Jackson's right-hand man and positions himself to be Jackson's successor, which he becomes. In 1836, he's elected president. He's elected the 8th president. And everything is ready at this point for the great triumph of Martin Van Buren, the 2-term presidency he expected, the restoration of New York as the most powerful state in the Union. All these things were supposed to happen. None of them did. And why is that? Why can't I write a book that says Van Buren's presidency was one of the best in American history? Well, because it was one of the worst in American history. A number of things went horribly wrong in 4 short years. And that to me was interesting because it just shows the simple fact that the best organized politician, which Van Buren is a candidate for that, extraordinary powers of organization, cannot control the chaotic forces of history. What happened? About 4 weeks after he became president in March of 1837, a terrible financial panic hit the United States, first in New York City and then everywhere, including Europe and other places around the world, showing that in many ways this already was a global economy. He tried a number of fiscal measures to improve the situation, but at the time, the presidency only had so much leverage on the American economy. There just wasn't that much he could do. Congress was hostile to much that he was trying to do. The situation stabilized somewhat over 4 years, but there was another mini depression 2 years later. He never really emerged from the cloud of the Panic of 1837. It's an interesting moment, however, for New York history for a couple reasons. Most people were wiped out. A few very savvy investors bought up property extremely cheaply. One of them was Cornelius Roosevelt, the grandfather of Teddy Roosevelt, laying the foundation for the Roosevelt family fortune. Another New Yorker whose life was changed forever by the 1837 panic was Herman Melville. His family lost everything, and a few years later he had to go to sea as a common sailor, so we wouldn't have gotten Moby Dick without the Panic of 1837 either. Nearly as bad as the panic was the problem of slavery during the Van Buren presidency. It was a problem that had been swept under the rug by president after president. It was no longer possible to do that. There's a moment in certain kinds of history where a problem just comes out full-blown. It can't be contained anymore. And slavery does this in the late 1830s, exactly on Van Buren's watch. There are some specific reasons. The agreement not to talk about slavery on the floor of Congress falls apart. It's called the gag rule. And that agreement ceases to bind members. And so suddenly slavery is being discussed in very angry language on the floor of Congress. But there are other reasons. Abolitionists are becoming better and better organized. And the South is becoming more and more violent in its response to abolitionism. There are some very ugly murders of abolitionists committed in the late 1830s. The consensus to disagree no longer holds. People can't even talk about it. It's analogous in some ways to the late 1960s and what happened with the Vietnam War, the 1968 Democratic Convention. Just the fragile ability to be differing and yet friendly no longer remained, and both parties, the Whig and Democratic parties in the late 1830s, begin to fall apart. Interestingly, Van Buren's vice president is one of the most interesting top executives in American history in terms of his own racial behavior. A relatively obscure vice president named Richard M. Johnson from Kentucky, an old war hero, an old Indian fighter, has an African-American wife. His first wife, who was African-American, had died, and he had 2 daughters by her whom he insisted on being recognized with him socially wherever he went. But he had remarried a 19-year-old woman, also African-American. And if Van Buren had died for some reason in office, we would have had a very interesting problem in that there would have been a president who insisted on his African-American wife being the First Lady of the United States. It never came to that, but it's an interesting problem to think about. Vice President Richard Johnson, the president of the Senate, while some of the most bitter arguments to that point in American history about slavery are happening, and he's up there, and everyone in that room knows that he has an African-American wife. And then the third reason things really don't go very well in his presidency is politics begins to fail. This delicately balanced two-party system that Van Buren has organized starts to turn against him. He can't control his own party because of the regional split. And the other side, the Whig Party, begins to learn all of his best tricks. So it must have been galling to be on the receiving end, but he was. There's a devastating speech given on the floor of Congress by a Pennsylvania congressman named Charles Ogle that lists all of Van Buren's renovations to the White House. He'd done a bit of landscape gardening, and there were some undulating mounds and some flower beds, and some of them had French names. And he'd also bought some French furniture. And so this Whig just read all the French kinds of furniture, Whenever you need a way to attack someone, if you can accuse them of liking French furniture, it never fails. So that also goes against Van Buren. And the 1840 Whig campaign, it's one of the most famous in American political history, the log cabin and hard cider and log cabin campaign, which celebrates the frontier origins of William Henry Harrison, who didn't really have frontier origins. It's exactly Van Buren's kind of trick being played against Van Buren. Van Buren's caught in the inside role. He's running as president. Everyone hates him. It all falls apart. So he leaves the White House in some disgrace, not personal disgrace, but his presidency has not been a ringing triumph. And the story might have ended there, and I would have had a worse book, but it doesn't. Again, this Dutch tenacity, this refusal to lose, manifested itself. And that was part of why I never lost interest in Van Buren. In 1842, he decides he wants the nomination back. He wants to fight back and win in 1844. He goes on his longest trip to date. Just these trips, that would be a good dissertation for some PhD candidate. Van Buren's shadowy trips across America. He goes deeply into the South and then very far to the West. He's the first former or current president to visit Chicago. And in that same trip in 1842, he's in Illinois, and his horse and buggy break down in a little town called Rochester, Illinois. And he hasn't even made it to where he's supposed to speak that night. He's in a barn, and the local family's desperate to entertain him. They think, we've got a former president here, what do we do? And they think, let's send for the funniest person in the county. And the call goes out to a very young Abraham Lincoln to come over. And they spent the night telling political stories to each other. And we actually have a little bit of evidence about what happened. Not much, but Van Buren told someone afterwards it was the funniest night of his entire life. He stayed up all night till his sides were sore from laughing. Isn't that fascinating? Lincoln's first time meeting a former president, and Van Buren's first time meeting Abraham Lincoln. It's just a little snapshot of American history. He comes very close to winning back the nomination in 1844, but he's done in by treachery within his own party. The Southern Democrats abandon him, and he's angry. He's angry at the South from that moment on. 4 years later, in 1848, he launches a great third-party effort. So here, again, I find him fascinating. He's doing something that's almost the exact opposite of his great legacy. We think of him as the great party builder, and here he's almost destroying the party he built. He runs like Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. He's so angry at his own party that he runs on the Free Soil platform. And it's a very unusual campaign. A lot of the abolitionists have not liked Van Buren. Jim mentioned the Amistad case, which happens during Van Buren's presidency. And Van Buren's not good on the Amistad case. He's supportive of the Southern attempts to reclaim those slaves. But he's educating himself throughout his life. And in 1848, he's pronounced himself as an I wouldn't quite call him an abolitionist, but he's certainly anti-slavery. He's against the expansion of slavery into the West. And he joins forces with the son of John Quincy Adams, his old rival, and they form a new kind of Northern party that's very much the forerunner of the Republican Party. So you could argue, you could make a stretch of an argument that Martin Van Buren invents the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. He doesn't do so badly. He gets 10% of the vote in 1848, and he has the great satisfaction of ruining it for the Democrat who was running and throwing it to the Whigs. So it's a complicated kind of satisfaction, but he's happy with what he did. And he writes a little-known document that I found quite moving. In that summer of 1848, actually in the spring, he takes up an apartment in Washington Square Park, where so many great literary manifestos are written in the 20th century, and he writes something that becomes known as the Barn Burner Manifesto. And it's just a very eloquent statement of why Americans can no longer tolerate the westward expansion of slavery or the political chicanery of the Southern slave power, how they're disrupting what's crucial about fair play and essential democracy in American politics. I believe he's the only president between John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln to come out and say slavery is evil. Then he lives and lives and lives. Like a patriarch in a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel, he just keeps going and begins to outlive his children, his grandchildren, until no one can really remember who he is anymore. He lives into the age of photography, and there are these fascinating spectral images of him sort of shrinking, but still with these penetrating eyes looking into the camera in the 1850s. He lives so long that he has one last moment of relevance. The Civil War, of course, begins in 1861, and no one knows what's going to happen. It's completely uncharted water for the United States of America. And a lot of people look to Van Buren. Van Buren, who knew Thomas Jefferson, and he was in a room in New York when Alexander Hamilton was haranguing the Federalist Party. And he went to Quincy, Massachusetts to meet John Adams just before he died, who knew many of the writers of the Constitution. He's looked to as a great sage in these matters. And all of the ex-presidents, there are 5 former presidents, try to have a meeting of the ex-presidents. It's convened by Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. And they write to Van Buren, ask him to lead this delegation, to give advice to the nation. And Van Buren smells disunion in it. He knows who these spineless ex-presidents are. And he has been accused of spinelessness before in his life. And he just says, I want no part of this. This is not where we're going. The attack on Fort Sumter is an attack on the United States of America and upon democracy. I'm with President Lincoln. All New York Democrats should be with President Lincoln. And it's at a very dicey moment when people aren't sure which way New York is going to go. And Lincoln is profoundly grateful to Van Buren for this great act of statesmanship at the end of his life. Van Buren dies in July of 1862, July 24th, a day and a half after Abraham Lincoln reads the first draft of his Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. I believe there's a copy in this building. Same month as Lincoln promulgates the Morrill Act, which authors the great system of state universities in this country, and the Pacific Railroad Act, which authorizes the building of a transcontinental railroad. And I love that fact about Lincoln, which I think is also true about Van Buren, which no matter how bad things are, there's an essential optimism inside of democracy that you can always think of a new program that will benefit people. And that, I think, is part of this unlikely friendship between Abraham Lincoln and Martin Van Buren. Lincoln wrote a beautiful eulogy, a statement on Van Buren's death that I have in the book. And he decreed that for 6 months after his death, all officers in the Union Army and Navy had to wear black crepe on their arms. So through some of the worst fighting of the Civil War, Antietam and Fredericksburg, every officer was wearing a little piece of black cloth because of Martin Van Buren. So that's the life. Why does it matter? Jim said a few of the reasons. He's the first New York president. He's our first ethnic president, really our only ethnic president. He's one of our poorest presidents. There's a fact that amused me in the research. I discovered that in 1956, a young girl named Pauline Friedman in San Francisco wanted to become an advice columnist. And the editor, I believe it was the San Francisco Chronicle, said, your name is too ethnic. You need to come up with a name readers can identify with. So she said, fine, I'll be Abigail Van Buren, dear Abby, because it sounds kind of rich. And how ironic Van Buren would have found that when his whole life he was poor Martin Van Buren, who just wasn't as wealthy as everyone else. In all these ways, he's a very worthy representative of New York State and New York City, where he lived on and off his entire life. A few lucky gifts came my way while I was writing this book. One of them was 2 alumni of Skull and Bones at Yale University ran for president in 2004, and some investigative journalism dug up the skulls that are actually, I mean, they didn't literally dig them up, but found out whose skulls are entombed in the Skull and Bones crypt in New Haven, Connecticut. Apparently, the three skulls that are there are probably more, Pancho Villa, the Mexican revolutionary, Geronimo, and Martin Van Buren. At first it makes no sense, but it does make a certain kind of cosmic sense, because throughout his life, Martin Van Buren drove powerful people crazy. He was a constant threat to the status quo. He was the kind of guy who looks at a legal contract and finds a loophole that no one thought of, or who looks at a state constitution and says, this isn't representative of the way people really lead their lives. There are a lot of new people in New York City. They don't own $140 worth of real estate. We need to get them into this process. If they're not going to let us, we're going to rewrite the state constitution. And if that constitution isn't good enough in 20 more years, we're going to write another one. That's the kind of outlook Van Buren had. There was nothing in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence that foresaw those kinds of problems in the 19th century. They had to be worked through generation after generation. There was nothing anywhere in the Constitution or the Declaration about the rise of New York City, the great fact of 19th century American history. Thomas Jefferson is on record over and over again as being not only indifferent, but actively hostile to the rise of cities. I mean, that was the great truth that came out of the brilliant Hamilton exhibit here a couple years ago, why Hamilton was so important. I think Van Buren is very much in the Hamiltonian tradition, even though Van Buren's also a Jeffersonian, but he's Hamiltonizing Jefferson and Jeffersonizing Hamilton. So more than anyone of his generation, he got why cities were important, why democracy was important, and why this particular city was important. And I'd like to close by reading some words that are written on a diary held in this building, the great diary of George Templeton Strong. Many of you have read it, I'm sure. But in 1841, as Van Buren came in complete, at the nadir of his political career, a loser in every sense, came back to New York City with no idea what he was going to do next, having lost to William Henry Harrison. He found a reception, an unexpected reception waiting for him on the docks of New York City. And George Templeton Strong was there to witness it. George Templeton Strong, a very well-to-do Whig, and Strong was filled with complete disgust at what ensued, because it said so powerfully what made Martin Van Buren a worthwhile person. March 23rd, 1841, had to wait half an hour in the drizzle at the corner of Rector Street and Broadway while Mattie's triumphal procession was going up. A disgusting assemblage of the unwashed democracy they were, generally speaking, a more rowdy, draggle-tailed, jailbird-resembling gang of truculent loafers than the majority of them I never witnessed before. Considering the rain, it's raining, they turned out in force, and the rain, by the by, was a blessing to some of them, for the ablution was badly needed. Butler boys on horseback, there was an unlimited number of them. Carts with 20 little blackguards sticking to each. A dozen grand marshals with chapeaus and swords galloping about and getting into everybody's way in the intensity of the excitement. These just little children. Several very formidable brass bands, diverse gorgeous banners, and so forth, with a great predominance of pedestrians from the neighborhood of the 5 Points, apparently. And then came the triumphal car, to wit, a shabby barouche and four, with Matty himself, hat in hand, looking as happy as a man could be expected to in the rain without hat or umbrella. He looks older than I supposed. Strong is trying so hard to make this seem like a pathetic group of people. And as I read it, it's the opposite. There's an incredible energy coming out of this draggle-tailed, disgusting, dirty group of people waiting for their champion to come back from Washington. There was an instinctive cord tying these underrepresented people on the docks of New York City and boring Martin Van Buren. And I didn't realize it until I wrote this book, but I know it now, and I'm glad I do. Thanks so much.